The faint clang of the school bell bled into silence, its echo stretching down the narrow hallway like a warning no one could name. In a small classroom in Brownsville, the air was still heavy with the smell of pencil shavings and chalk. Jimmy, nobody called him that kindly, sat hunched over his desk, his elbows tight against his ribs. He'd learned to keep the record tucked deep in his bag, where no one could see the gold-printed letters. Elvis Presley. The last time he'd dared to lay it on the desk, laughter had rippled through the room like a thrown stone breaking water. The teacher's voice droned on, but every muscle in Jimmy's back was drawn tight, bracing against whatever might come next. Then, over it all, came the low, uneven growl of an engine outside. It wasn't the sound of the janitor's pickup or the school bus. This was heavier, deeper, the kind that turned heads without trying. The room stilled before the door even opened, and when it did, it wasn't a teacher stepping in. The figure in the doorway didn't rush, didn't smile. Boots on the worn floor, a presence that seemed to fill the air before a single word was spoken. Jimmy's chest went hollow. Someone had just crossed the invisible line between the world where he kept his music hidden and the one where it might finally matter. Who was he? And why was he here? Now, let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The air in room 14 felt heavier than usual, though the windows stood open to the soft spill of a Tennessee spring morning. Chalk dust lingered like faint smoke near the blackboard, drifting in slow spirals each time the ceiling fan groaned overhead. Jimmy sat at his desk, shoulders curled in the practiced fold of someone who had learned that making himself smaller was safer. His notebook lay open, though he hadn't written a word in minutes. The low hum of whispering from the row behind him kept breaking through his thoughts. A faint scent of gasoline drifted in through the window. Someone's car idling out front, louder than any teacher's voice. Then the door opened. It wasn't the principal, or a teacher with another stack of worksheets. The man who stepped inside wore a plain denim jacket, cuffs turned once at the wrist, the kind of jacket that had seen miles of sun and road. He carried no books, no clipboard, just a quiet, unhurried presence. His eyes scanned the room once, not sharp, not searching, more like someone finding a familiar face in a crowd. A half-second of stillness passed before they landed on Jimmy. The class quieted without knowing why. "Mr. Virgil?" Mrs. Carver, the English teacher, said in a tone that was both a question and an introduction. She didn't explain who he was. Maybe she didn't know for sure, or maybe she understood that the moment didn't need the interruption. Virgil Presley stepped farther in. He wasn't a tall man, not exactly, but he carried a stillness that made the air move around him differently. A thin smell of road dust and motor oil clung to him, the kind that comes from driving too far without stopping. His boots made a soft weight against the wood floor as he closed the gap between them. Jimmy felt his pulse pick up. He knew that name, though no one in the room had said it out loud yet. The whispers from the back row had stopped entirely now. Only the faint scratch of the ceiling fan broke the silence. Somewhere in the hallway, faint and grainy through a small wall speaker, the opening bars of "Don't Be Cruel" floated in. The recording was scratchy, maybe coming from a portable transistor radio someone had left on near the office. Jimmy had heard the song before, hundreds of times on his own small turntable, but never like this, never as the backdrop to a moment that seemed to stand outside of time. Virgil stopped just short of Jimmy's desk. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Virgil bent slightly, the denim of his jacket creasing at the elbows, and said, low enough for only Jimmy to hear, "You're not alone. He wants you to be yourself." No one else heard the words, But everyone saw the lean, the way the man's gaze didn't waver. His hand didn't reach out. It didn't have to. The tilt of his head, the set of his shoulders, even the way his boots planted square on the floor, all carried the same message. We stand together. Jimmy's throat tightened. For weeks, the weight of small humiliations, a kicked chair leg, a muffled laugh when he answered in class, had pressed him further inward. Now, under that gaze, his back uncurled almost before he realized it. He straightened, the desk pressing lightly against his ribs, and for the first time in months, he met the stares of the room without looking away. Somewhere in the hallway, the music cut off abruptly, as if someone had lifted the needle mid-song. The silence that followed was sharper, more alive. Jimmy could hear the faint pop of the overhead lights, the distant clank of a locker closing down the corridor. His heartbeat filled the space between. Virgil gave the smallest nod, the kind of nod you give not to reassure, but to confirm what you already see happening. He stepped back just enough to take the edge off the moment, then turned to face the rest of the room. The class didn't shift or shuffle. It was as if the air had thickened around them. Mrs. Carver didn't say a word. She simply stepped aside near the board, eyes on Jimmy for a heartbeat longer than usual, before looking away as though she were giving him privacy. Jimmy felt something, not quite courage, but the beginning of it, settle in his chest. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself. It was in the way Virgil had appeared without fanfare, the way the music had framed those seconds, and in the silence that came after, holding the moment steady. It was in knowing that this wasn't some staged assembly or a polite adult pep talk. It was real, and it was meant for him. The scent of chalk dust, the faint gasoline tang from outside, the quiet creak of Virgil's boots. Each detail pressed itself into Jimmy's memory. Years later, he would remember that before Virgil stepped into the room, the space had felt like any other ordinary classroom. And after he left, it never quite did again. Virgil straightened, his eyes catching Jimmy's once more before he turned toward the door. No grand gestures, no speeches, just that same steady presence walking out the way he came in, leaving the class still hushed in his wake. Jimmy sat taller for the rest of the morning. That evening, the sky hung low over the neighborhood. Clouds stretched thin like worn cotton. Jimmy walked home slower than usual, the rhythm of his steps uneven. The image of Virgil leaning close still hovered in his mind. Not the words themselves, but the weight behind them. He stepped up onto the porch, the wood planks giving a small groan under his shoes, and pushed the door open. The house smelled faintly of fried okra and laundry soap. In the corner of his small bedroom, the radio sat on a narrow dresser, its dial glowing amber. A thread of static cut through the room, followed by the smooth, unmistakable cadence of Elvis's voice. Not singing, but speaking. "Hold that hand, boy. Don't let go now." The message was part of a broadcast Jimmy had never heard before, some fan club segment from who knows when. The tone was light, but the phrasing carried a quiet firmness, like a hand pressing gently between your shoulder blades. The timbre of it filled the narrow space, settling into the walls. Jimmy didn't move. His fingers rested on the back of the wooden chair near the bed. He could hear the low hum of the tubes inside the radio, the occasional tiny click as the signal shifted. Outside, a car rolled slowly down the street, its tires whispering over wet asphalt. The door behind him eased open without a knock. His mother stepped in, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at him first, then at the radio, and then at the 45 RPM record sitting on the dresser beside it, the one he almost never let anyone touch. Her hand hovered over it, waiting for permission. He hesitated. Then, without saying anything, he slid it toward her. The look on her face softened. She picked it up carefully, holding it between her fingers as if it were made of glass. For a moment, she didn't speak, and Jimmy saw the glimmer at the edge of her lashes before she turned her head slightly, blinking it away. The front door creaked again, this time with a firmer push. Mrs. Josie Hall, their neighbor from 2 houses down, stepped inside, her voice carrying ahead of her. Josie had once worked as a housekeeper at Graceland in the early 60s, and she still told stories that could hold an entire porch full of adults in silence. She carried a small paper envelope in her hand, folded at the top. "I was asked to bring this by," she said, her voice low, as though the hallway had ears. She placed the envelope on the dresser. Jimmy glanced at his mother, then reached for it. The paper was warm from her hand. Inside was a postcard, edges slightly curled. On the back, in a small looping script, was written, "Keep your head up. The road's longer than it looks. E.P." The ink had the faint blue of a ballpoint that had lived in someone's pocket for years. The room seemed to shrink around him. He read the words twice before daring to turn the card over. On the front was a black-and-white shot of Elvis leaning against a Cadillac, his hair wind-ruffled, the kind of photo you didn't find in record store bins. He could almost imagine it had been plucked straight from a dresser drawer. A single lamp lit the room, its shade tilted slightly from years of use. The warm light caught floating specks of dust, each moving slow and aimless. Jimmy felt the contrast as sharply as a slap. Just hours ago he'd been under the weight of classroom stairs, and now here, in this narrow space, there was nothing but quiet and the steady pulse of the lamp's glow. The radio popped once, then went silent, leaving only the low ticking of the hallway clock. His mother set the record gently back in its sleeve. When she looked at him again, her expression carried something different. Not just concern, but the decision to stand beside him. "I was thinking," she said carefully, "about that museum over in Louisiana, the one with the big Elvis room. Maybe we could take a trip, just you and me." Jimmy blinked. The suggestion came out of nowhere. His mother rarely left the county, except for groceries or church. He searched her face for the hesitation he expected, but found none. Josie smiled at him knowingly. "It'd do you good, boy. And besides," she added, "not every kid gets to see the kind of things I've seen." She patted the dresser, her palm making a soft thump over the envelope, and stepped back toward the hallway. Jimmy slid the postcard into the narrow gap between 2 books on his shelf, not to hide it, but to keep it standing upright where he could see it from his bed. The inked letters seemed to hold their own light, faint but steady. As the women's voices drifted toward the kitchen, he sat on the edge of his bed and looked again at the glowing radio dial. Somewhere out there, the voice that had filled this room belonged to a man who didn't know him, but had, somehow, sent a message that fit the exact size of his small, bruised world. It wasn't a grand rescue. It was smaller than that. A seed dropped quietly into the soil, where no one else could see it yet. But Jimmy could feel it there, just the same. The old '64 Chevrolet groaned awake before the sun had fully lifted above the rooftops. Its blue paint, faded almost to gray, still held the faint smell of gasoline and rain-soaked roads. Jimmy slid into the passenger seat, the cracked vinyl warm already from the early light. His mother adjusted the rear-view mirror, the chain of her small cross swaying gently as the engine idled. They set off along the narrow county road, fields unrolling on either side. The radio, mounted crooked in the dash, crackled to life with the sharp pluck of a guitar, the opening to a live cut from the '68 comeback special. The applause from that old recording spilled into the car's small space, echoing around them as if they'd driven straight into the middle of an unseen crowd. Jimmy leaned his elbow against the open window, letting the warm wind tug at his sleeve. The music didn't just fill the car. It carried a kind of electricity, a pulse that didn't come from the wires and tubes inside the radio, but from something older, deeper. For the first time, he didn't feel like a distant listener. The sound pressed forward, as if inviting him to take hold of it. The museum in Louisiana sat at the edge of town, its brick facade shaded by two sprawling magnolias. The air carried a mix of sweet blossoms and faint motor oil from the nearby lot. Inside, glass cases stretched down a long room, each holding some fragment of another life. Sequined jackets, scuffed boots, handwritten lyric sheets with lines scratched out and rewritten in thick pencil. By the entrance to the main hall, Jimmy noticed a man in a worn army jacket, a small pin glinting on the collar. He was leaning on a cane, studying a framed photograph. Something in the man's posture, the way his shoulders lifted slightly when he breathed in, drew Jimmy closer. "You like the music?" the man asked without looking up. Jimmy nodded. "Kept me company once," the veteran said. His voice was low, with a rasp like old paper being folded. "Back in the hospital, after they pulled me out of Da Nang, the nurses had a little radio in the corridor. Couldn't sleep, not with the noise in my head. But late at night, if I caught the right station, I'd hear him. Felt like someone had found the hallway I was stuck in, and just stayed there with me." He smiled faintly, eyes still on the photograph. "Sometimes that's all a person needs." Jimmy didn't answer. He didn't want to break whatever was holding the man's voice steady. They moved deeper into the museum. Near the back, a small stage had been set for a local school group visiting that day. To Jimmy's surprise, half the faces belonged to kids from his own class. Some sat cross-legged on the floor, whispering. A man with a leather camera strap slung over his shoulder was adjusting a microphone stand. He turned, caught sight of Jimmy, and grinned. "You play a little, don't you?" the man asked. He had the easy tone of a radio host, the kind used to coaxing answers out of people. Without waiting for a reply, he held out the microphone. "Give us something." Jimmy's mouth went dry. The faces in front of him shifted. Some curious, some half-smiling in that way he'd learned to brace against. He took the mic, its metal cool against his palm, and pulled in a breath. The sound of it in his ears was louder than he expected. "That's all right," he began, the first words of the old song quiet, but steady. His voice didn't stretch far, but it landed. The restless shuffle of the room eased, the air pulling tight around the sound. He sang just a single line before letting the silence take over. No one laughed. Even the ones who'd traded whispers in the hallway days before sat still. In that small space between the last word and the next noise, he felt something shift. Not fully, not forever, but enough to mark the moment. Applause came, gentle, but real. He handed the microphone back. In the cluster of students, one boy, someone who'd been quick with jabs and louder than most, met Jimmy's gaze. For a second, his expression wasn't mockery, but something closer to uncertainty, maybe even regret. Then he looked away. Jimmy stepped down from the stage, the sound of the recording from the '68 special still humming faintly in his chest. Outside, through the museum's open door, he could see the sunlight catching on the roof of the Chevrolet, waiting to carry them home. The week after the museum trip, the hallways felt different. The usual current of whispers and sidelong glances had thinned. A few kids who once found sport in snickering behind their notebooks now just passed by without comment. It wasn't kindness exactly, but it was a less jagged kind of quiet. Jimmy noticed it most in the mornings, when the walk from his locker to homeroom no longer felt like moving through a gauntlet. But not everyone had changed. One afternoon, he returned from gym to find his desk drawer slightly ajar. Inside, the pen Josie had given him, the one with EP engraved on the clip, lay in two pieces, the barrel snapped clean in half. A faint, acrid smell of scorched plastic and metal lingered in the small cavity. He lifted both halves out slowly, feeling the uneven edge where the plastic had given way. Someone behind him laughed under their breath. He didn't look to see who. The rest of the day passed in slow, colorless intervals. Even the spring light through the classroom windows seemed dulled. By the final bell, his thoughts were fixed on the weightless emptiness in his pocket where the pen used to rest. That evening, as he was leaving the building, his English teacher, Mrs. Carver, caught up to him in the corridor. She carried her books against her hip and lowered her voice as they reached the front steps. "There's a band playing in town this Saturday," she said. "They do nothing but Elvis numbers. Good ones, too. Not the kind you hear at county fairs. I know the lead guitarist. If you want, I can get you backstage." Jimmy hesitated, still tasting the bitterness of the day. But something in her tone, the absence of pity, the simple offering, made it hard to refuse. He nodded. Saturday night, the local auditorium was alive with heat and movement. The smell of floor polish mixed with cigarette smoke and the faint sweetness of soda syrup. Backstage was narrower than he expected, lined with instrument cases and the tang of amplifier tubes warming up. The guitarist Mrs. Carver had mentioned was tuning a cherry-red hollow body. When he spotted Jimmy, his face broke into a grin. "You're the kid she told me about," he said. "Couple weeks back, we got this crate from Memphis. Care package from the man himself for schools and fan clubs. Most of it's gone now, but—" He turned to a case on a nearby chair, rummaging for a moment before pulling something out. It was a guitar pick, thick and worn, its surface scratched from years of contact with strings. The edges were smoothed by use, the white imprint almost faded. He placed it in Jimmy's palm. "He used this on tour in '72. Figured you might give it a better home than my dresser drawer." The pick was heavier than it looked. Jimmy turned it over between his fingers, feeling the slight indentations where a thumb might have pressed. In the noise and bustle backstage, it became an anchor, something solid in his hand. Out front, the crowd erupted as the lights dimmed. The first bright chords of Burning Love rolled out, rattling the thin walls. For a moment, the broken pen was forgotten. The jagged edge it left behind in him was eased, if not erased, by the weight of that small triangle of plastic. Proof that sometimes the world gave back in unexpected ways. When they stepped outside after the show, the night air felt clearer. The street lamps cast wide amber circles on the pavement, and Jimmy slipped the pick into the inside pocket of his jacket, close enough to feel it when he moved. The idea came late one night, when the house was still, and the only sound was the low murmur of the refrigerator cycling on and off. Jimmy sat at the kitchen table, the dim bulb above casting a soft cone of light over a single sheet of lined paper. He'd thought about writing before, small scraps of phrases or questions to Elvis, quickly abandoned because they felt too clumsy. But tonight, something in him wouldn't let it slide. He picked up a fountain pen borrowed from his mother's sewing desk. The nib scratched faintly over the paper, the ink smelling faintly metallic as it dried in narrow lines. He wrote about the music, about the way certain songs felt like they could hold a person together when nothing else did. He wrote about school, though not in detail, just enough to explain why certain days felt longer than they should. At the bottom, he hesitated, then signed simply, "Jimmy, from Tennessee." The envelope was plain. No decoration, no flourish, just his careful block letters on the front, and the Graceland address he'd copied from a fan club bulletin on the back page of a magazine. He slid the letter in, sealed it, and placed it in the stack of outgoing mail by the door. He didn't expect anything to happen. Weeks passed. The trees along the street began to shift toward their full green, the last edge of winter gone. Then, one afternoon, the sound of tires crunching over gravel pulled Jimmy to the window. The postman was walking up the path with a small bundle in his hand. At the top was a cream-colored envelope, heavier than usual, the return address stamped Memphis, Tennessee. Jimmy's fingers trembled slightly as he tore it open. Inside was a folded note, the paper thick, almost velvety. The handwriting wasn't the neat, generic script of a secretary. It was looser, more personal. Elvis saw your story in the fan bulletin. He wanted you to have this, something he carried during the '72 tour. Said to tell you he thinks you've got your own kind of stage, even if it's not made of wood. Wrapped in a small square of cloth was a silver cross on a fine chain. The metal was cool to the touch, catching the afternoon light in quick flashes as it shifted in his palm. He turned it over, noticing a tiny scuff on one edge, a mark that proved it had been worn, not just bought. That evening, the town felt different somehow. The street lamps were already glowing as he walked past the shuttered storefronts toward the old cinema. Its marquee was missing half its letters, the flicker of the remaining bulbs uneven. He wasn't planning on going inside. He just liked the quiet stretch of sidewalk there. But the moment he stepped into the glow of the entrance, he saw it. A black Cadillac idling at the curb, chrome trim gleaming in the muted light. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in dark glasses stepped out. His suit jacket barely moved in the light wind. "Tomorrow," the man said quietly, as though it were the most ordinary instruction in the world. "Be at school. 10 o'clock. No explanation followed. He simply tipped his head once, got back into the car, and pulled away, the rumble of the engine fading into the distance. Jimmy stood there for a long moment, the silver cross still warm from his hand. Whatever tomorrow was going to bring, it felt as close and solid as the weight of the chain now hanging against his palm. Morning came bright but unsettled, the kind of light that seemed too sharp for the hour. Jimmy dressed slower than usual, his mind replaying the low, deliberate voice outside the theater. Be at school. 10 o'clock. He had no proof of what he thought it meant, only the pull in his chest that kept him moving. By the time he reached the schoolyard, a faint buzz had already built among the students. Clusters of kids leaned against the brick wall, trading guesses about who might be visiting. The most confident insisted it was some local politician. Others claimed it was a baseball player passing through. Jimmy kept his head down, the weight of the silver cross steady under his shirt. The first bell rang. Classes began in the usual rhythm, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers, the occasional creak from the hallway floorboards. But with each tick of the clock, the air grew tighter, like the room itself was waiting. At the start of second period, the door opened. He wasn't in rhinestones or leather. Instead, the man in the doorway wore a dark blue suit, the fabric carrying a soft sheen under the fluorescent lights. His hair was neat, but not overly styled, and there was no announcement, no fanfare. Just a steady, unhurried step into the room. Two men followed, clearly bodyguards, though they kept their distance, one carrying a cardboard box. Conversations dropped away. Even the ones who didn't recognize him right away seemed to feel the shift in the air. Jimmy's breath caught as the man's gaze moved through the room, not sweeping, but settling, and then locking on him. Elvis crossed the short space between them. He placed a hand lightly on Jimmy's shoulder, his touch firm but not heavy. "Heard you're not afraid to be yourself," he said, his voice low enough that the rest of the room had to lean in to catch it. "That's not something you see every day." Jimmy's heart thudded in his ears. He wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Elvis straightened, turned toward Mrs. Carver, and asked politely if he could have a few minutes with the class. He didn't lecture. He told them about being laughed at in school for his sideburns, for playing the kind of music no one thought would matter. He spoke about how easy it was to let other people's doubt settle into your own bones, and how hard it was to push it back out. His voice carried a warmth that made even the kids in the back, the ones who never stopped fidgeting, sit still. Then, without breaking the flow, he reached into the box and pulled out a guitar. It wasn't the stage-slick kind most had seen in photographs. The wood was worn at the edges, the finish dulled by years of playing. He perched on the corner of Mrs. Carver's desk and let his fingers find a slow, rolling chord. The song he played wasn't one anyone in that room had heard him perform before, a gospel piece stripped bare to its frame. His voice dropped to a near whisper in the low notes, then rose just enough to fill the small space without overwhelming it. The hum of the fluorescent lights faded from notice. Even the ticking clock seemed to stop. When the last chord settled into silence, no one moved. It was the kind of quiet usually reserved for church pews, where the air feels heavier, as if holding something in place. Elvis rested the guitar across his knees for a moment, looking at no one in particular, then handed it off to one of the guards. He stood, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening as he smiled. Not the broad show smile from television, but something smaller, more human. The class remained frozen as he turned toward the door, each step unhurried. Outside, somewhere down the hall, the usual clamor of lockers and voices was waiting to start again. But in that room, the world had paused. Jimmy sat motionless, the warmth from that brief hand on his shoulder still lingering, as if it had left something behind that wouldn't wash away. The air in the classroom still felt thick, as though the final note hadn't yet dissolved. Elvis stood, handed the guitar back into the box, and began lifting records from it one by one. Each was tucked in a clear plastic sleeve, the vinyl catching stray light from the windows. He didn't stack them in neat piles for the teacher to hand out later. He walked between the rows himself. When he reached Jimmy's desk, he paused longer than at the others. From the box, he drew out a copy of Elvis Country, I'm 10,000 Years Old. Not the common sleeve, but the rare run with a sepia-toned cover. In black ink, across the bottom corner, his name looped in broad strokes, the pen pressure visible even through the plastic. "For you," Elvis said simply, placing it on the desk so that it rested against Jimmy's hands. The vinyl had a faint, almost sweet scent of the cardboard jacket and years of careful storage. Jimmy's fingers curled around it, not daring to grip too hard. Around him, other students murmured softly as they looked over their own records. One of the boys, who'd been quick to laugh at Jimmy in the past, lingered after the bell, shifting his weight from foot to foot before finally speaking. "I didn't know he was like that," the boy said, his voice low. "Guess I didn't know much." Outside, the midday sun had climbed high, pouring through the classroom windows and striking motes of dust into brief sparks. Elvis moved toward the doorway, the guards trailing a few steps behind. On the threshold, he stopped and glanced back. His eyes found Jimmy again, the same steady connection as in the first second they'd met. In the small rectangle of sunlight spilling across the floor, Elvis leaned just slightly toward him. "Keep that cross close," he said quietly, "and don't hand your voice to anyone who can't hear it." The words landed with a weight Jimmy could feel in his chest. Then Elvis straightened, stepped into the hall, and was gone. Jimmy walked out to the front steps a few minutes later, records tucked under his arm. The parking lot was half empty. Near the edge, the black Cadillac sat waiting. Elvis was already inside, the glass dark, but as the engine rumbled to life, Jimmy thought he saw a small movement, a raised hand in farewell. The car rolled away, the hum of its tires fading into the distance. Only then did the ordinary sounds of the school return. The clatter of lockers, bursts of laughter from the far end of the hall, the metallic slam of the cafeteria door. Jimmy stayed on the steps a moment longer, feeling the sunlight warm the vinyl jacket through its plastic. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew something had shifted. Not just in the way others saw him, but in the way he saw himself. And in that quiet space after the music, he realized that sometimes the most lasting part of a song was the silence it left behind. Weeks slipped by, in a rhythm that felt unfamiliar. The school hallways no longer carried the same weight in Jimmy's stomach. The sharp jabs and whispered names had faded, replaced by nods in passing and, occasionally, something stranger: curiosity. A few students even stopped him between classes to ask about the record or the visit, their tones tentative, almost careful. One afternoon, in the music room, 2 boys from his class stood by the upright piano. "Can you show us that chord he played?" one of them asked. Jimmy hesitated, then set his books aside. His fingers found the frets of the old-school guitar, the strings cool under his touch. As he showed them, their focus was genuine, not mocking, not impatient. The change wasn't loud, but it was steady. He began to imagine something he hadn't before: a small performance at the spring assembly. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about sharing the part of himself he'd always kept quiet. In the weeks leading up to it, he stayed after school in the music room, practicing until the janitor's keys jingled at the door. One Thursday, as he was packing up, the faint voice of a radio announcer drifted in from the janitor's cart in the hallway. The words made him pause. Elvis Presley's upcoming tour dates have been canceled due to concerns about the singer's health. The announcer's tone was measured, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Jimmy stood frozen, the strap of his guitar case in his hand. That night, the house was still except for the chirp of crickets outside the window. Jimmy sat on the porch steps, the wooden boards cool beneath him. The silver cross rested against his palm, its chain slipping between his fingers as he rolled it back and forth. The darkness felt heavier than usual. Then, from the quiet street, came the low purr of a familiar engine. Headlights curved into view, brushing over the front yard before settling on the curb. The Cadillac's door opened, and the same man in dark glasses stepped out, his movements unhurried. He approached the porch and handed Jimmy a small, unmarked cassette tape. "He wanted you to have this," the man said. No other explanation followed. He gave a short nod, returned to the car, and was gone as quickly as he'd arrived. Inside, Jimmy slid the cassette into the family's tape deck. A soft hiss filled the room, followed by a slow strum of guitar, the same gospel song Elvis had played in the classroom weeks earlier. But this time, between verses, came words not meant for an audience. "Hold steady, friend. I believe in you." The voice was softer, edges worn by fatigue, yet still carrying that same undercurrent of certainty. The tape ran to silence, the hiss growing louder until Jimmy pressed stop. He sat for a long time in the dim light of the living room, the cassette case resting in his lap. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees against the roof. It wasn't a storm, just enough to remind him that seasons were shifting, whether or not anyone was ready. For the first time in months, he felt no need to imagine the assembly or to rehearse what he might say to the crowd. The music, the words, the quiet weight of the cross against his chest. They were already part of him. Whatever was coming next, he knew the sound of it would carry forward, like wind through open fields. The fan in the living room labored against the August heat, chopping the air into slow, stubborn pieces. A television newscaster spoke over archival footage. Crowds, flashbulbs, a white suit under stage lights. And then the voice changed, careful and final. The words didn't land all at once. They arrived in pieces. Elvis, Graceland, today, gone. Jimmy reached for the knob and shut the set off before the anchor finished the sentence. The room fell into a hush so complete he could hear the faint tick behind the kitchen wall where the pipes expanded in the warmth. His mother stood in the doorway, the hem of her house dress brushing her calf. She didn't ask if he was all right. The question would have sounded hollow in that moment. She crossed the room and rested her palm against the back of his shoulder. Heat meeting heat. Neither of them spoke. The fan beat on. He carried the silence back to his bedroom, where the lamp cast a small pool of amber on the dresser. The cassette lay where he always kept it, its plastic case dull with handling. Next to it, the record he'd been given at school leaned against a stack of books, and the silver cross hung from a nail by the mirror. He took each in turn, weighing them as if to learn again what they meant. The cross went first into the old cedar chest at the foot of his bed, cushioned in a folded handkerchief. The cassette followed, then the record, tucked carefully so the sleeve wouldn't wrinkle. He closed the lid and felt the mild resistance of the hinges, a soft wooden sigh as it settled. The piano in the school auditorium hadn't been tuned all summer, but he knew the keys would still be where he left them. He set out with the light slanting low across lawns and cracked sidewalks. The building was unlocked for evening cleaning, the smell of mop water rising from the hall. He slipped into the auditorium and crossed the dull varnished floor, every footfall echoing up into the rafters. He didn't bother with the overhead lights. A row of windows near the ceiling held the last of the day, washing the room in a faded bronze. He lifted the piano lid and laid his hands on the keys. The first chord came out hushed, but steady, that old gospel shape returning to him as naturally as breath. He played it again, this time letting his left hand walk a deeper foundation, and the sound settled through the empty space like a benediction. The side door opened, one voice, then two, familiar without names. Former classmates, older by a summer but recognized by the way they shifted their weight before stepping forward. No one asked what he was playing. They entered on the second line, hesitant at first, then sure. Another pair of voices found the harmony above. Someone sat near the front and kept time with a fingertip on the seat back, soft as a heartbeat. A few notes wavered, but the chord held. Grief didn't break the sound. It thickened it, gave it weight. They sang until the last light left the windows, until a custodian's shadow crossed the aisle and paused, hat pressed to chest for a long moment before he moved on. When the echo thinned, they didn't clap. They let the quiet take the shape of respect. Jimmy closed the lid gently and stood. The students drifted out without speeches or plans, faces drawn but steadier than when they'd come in. On the way home, the locusts had begun their high static in the trees, a different kind of chorus, tireless and plain. Years stepped forward. The cedar chest moved with him, from his mother's house to a small apartment near the river, later to a narrow place with a noisy heater, and finally to a steady home where scuff marks along the baseboards told the story of small feet racing down hallways. He married, learned the sound of a baby's breath on his shoulder at 3 in the morning, discovered the exact creak in the stair that could wake a toddler from the deepest sleep. He played cheap guitars and better ones, not for a crowd, but for the circle of family that filled a living room on ordinary Sundays. On a spring afternoon, he set the chest on the dining table to polish the hinges. His boy, 10, elbows too sharp for his sleeves, the same restless eyes Jimmy had once offered to a classroom, leaned on the chair back and watched. "Can I?" the boy asked, hands hovering. Jimmy smiled and nodded. He lifted the lid and took out the cross, the chain cool and fine against his palm. For a moment he simply looked at it. Not a relic, not a headline frozen in metal, but a thing worn by a man whose voice had once reached into a hospital corridor, and a schoolroom, and a front porch at night. He motioned his son closer. "This was given to me a long time ago," he said. "I kept it near when I couldn't decide who I was, or whether I was worth deciding about. I want you to carry it, not because it will make you brave, but because it'll remind you that you already are." The boy nodded with a seriousness that made him seem older. Jimmy looped the chain around his neck. It lay there as if it had been made for him. As he lowered the cross into place, his fingers brushed the cedar at the bottom of the chest and struck something thin and folded, something that hadn't been there the last dozen times he'd looked. He reached down and lifted a small note, creased into a square. The paper had the faint sheen of stationery, the edge torn neatly by hand. His hands were steady until he unfolded it. Then the tremor came, so slight it would have gone unnoticed by anyone but himself. The ink had faded just a shade, but the handwriting was unmistakable, the loops firm, the lines sure. "Remember, boy, your voice matters. E." He read it twice without breathing. He tried to track the path by which it might have traveled. Tucked in the record sleeve, perhaps, or hidden behind the cardboard backing when he'd slid it away. Lost among moves and rooms and years, then shaken loose by the simple act of reaching for a story to pass on. He handed the paper to his son, who traced the letters with a fingertip, but didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The room held the answer. A chain of moments, plain and unspectacular on their own, that in their joining had become a bridge. That evening, as dusk settled over the yard, father and son sat together on the porch steps. The boy held the note flat between his hands to keep it from curling. Down the block, a lawn sprinkler ticked, turned, and ticked again. The world wasn't different. Bills would still arrive. Cars would still miss shifts. The piano at the school would still drift out of tune between visits. But the sound that had once traveled through radios and classrooms and a battered cassette now lived where no outage could touch it. Jimmy thought of the old auditorium, the way a few hesitant voices had grown into something larger than grief. He felt again the press of a hand on his shoulder, the lift of a single chord gathering a room to stillness. He imagined his boy, someday, in a room full of noise, remembering. Not the famous scenes, not the gold suit, not the sequins, not the flash of cameras. A smaller thing, the feel of paper warmed by his own hands and the weight of a cross settling against his heartbeat. A reminder, clear as if spoken in the next chair. Keep the note. Keep the time. Don't give away what you were given to carry. Night gathered slow and even. A train sounded miles away, its low call bending around the houses. Jimmy leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the sound pass through him. It wasn't an ending. It was the chord after the chord, the one that hums inside the body long after the room has emptied, the one that tells you to stand and walk and speak in your own measure. The music hadn't stopped. It had simply moved.